The air in the imperial suite was so still and cold, it felt like money. It was a silence purchased at great expense, a buffer of polished mahogany and triple-paned glass that held the shrieking chaos of the city at bay, transforming it into a muted, glittering tapestry below. Julian Vance watched a helicopter slide silently past the window, a dragonfly of the elite, and felt a familiar coil of dissatisfaction tighten in his gut. The silence was not peaceful. It was expectant, hungry. It was the sound of a billion-dollar deal hanging in the balance. He was a man built of sharp angles and expensive fabrics. His suit, a tailored slash of charcoal gray, seemed fused to his frame. His watch, a Patek Philippe, was not merely a timepiece but a statement of celestial navigation through the world of finance, its quiet ticking a counterpoint to the frantic thumping in his own chest. He paced the length of the Persian rug, the soft wool failing to absorb the aggressive energy emanating from him. Everything in the room, from the crystal decanters gleaming like frozen rivers on the bar, to the original abstract painting that was a hemorrhage of color and fury on the wall, was a testament to his power. Yet he felt powerless. His thoughts were a frantic ledger of risks and exposures. The Ishikawa deal was not just another acquisition, it was a legacy play. It was the move that would finally eclipse the long, cold shadow of his father. But the Japanese delegation was proving to be as inscrutable as the Zen koans they were fond of quoting. Their politeness was a form of armor, their smiles thin as paper cuts. For 3 days they had listened, nodded, and offered nothing. Julian's carefully constructed empire, built on aggressive takeovers and the brutal logic of the bottom line, felt like it was turning to sand. He needed this win. The hunger for it was a physical ache. Into this cathedral of tension, she moved like a ghost. Her name, he vaguely recalled from a roster, was Emmy. She was part of the hotel's fixtures, as unremarkable as the polished silver or the starched linen napkins. Her uniform, a sober navy blue dress, was impeccably clean, but showed the subtle sheen of age at the seams and elbows. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours and aching feet, her presence a quiet apology for her own existence. Her face, when he bothered to notice it, was a study in serene resignation, her dark eyes holding a depth he had neither the time nor the inclination to explore. She was refilling the water glasses, her hands steady as she handled the heavy crystal pitcher. The slight tremor in her fingers was the only sign of the exhaustion that radiated from her in quiet waves. She was from that other world, the one that served and cleaned and disappeared, the world that made his own possible. He saw her not as a person, but as a function, a pair of hands to perform a task. Her inner life, her history, her sorrows. They were as irrelevant to him as the life story of the cow that produced the leather for his shoes. The object that held the fate of his world was a leather-bound portfolio on the center of the table. Inside were the final terms of the proposal, a masterpiece of financial engineering designed by the sharpest minds on his payroll. It was a document of beautiful, brutal efficiency, outlining a future where Vance Global and Ishikawa Industries would merge into an unstoppable titan of global commerce. It was also, though he did not know it, a document riddled with the small, invisible cuts of cultural arrogance, each one a potential death blow to the deal. Julian stopped his pacing and glared at the portfolio as if it were an enemy combatant. His team of junior executives, 3 young men who mirrored his ambition but lacked his predatory instinct, sat stiffly on a leather couch, trying to look essential. They were like freshly minted coins, shiny and identical, their faces a mixture of fear and sycophantic eagerness. They watched him, waiting for a sign, a command, a release from the crushing pressure he radiated. The call came. Mr. Ishikawa and his delegation were on their way up. The final 10 minutes before their arrival were an exercise in controlled panic. Julian snapped orders, his voice like a whip cracking in the silent room. He straightened his tie, a silk sheath of silver and black, and ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. He was composing himself, putting on the mask of unshakable confidence that had won him so many battles. But beneath it, the fear of failure was a cold acid in his stomach. He was his father's son, and his father had never failed. It was a legacy that was both a crown and a curse. He reached for his coffee, his movements jerky and impatient. His hand shook, a minuscule betrayal he hoped no one noticed. A single, dark drop of coffee leapt from the porcelain cup. It landed squarely on the cover page of the Ishikawa proposal, a dark, spreading stain on the pristine white paper. A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, came from the junior executives. Julian's face went rigid. The stain was not just a mark, it was an omen, a symbol of the imperfection and chaos he fought so hard to control. A low growl of pure fury escaped his lips. His eyes, cold chips of blue ice, scanned the room and landed on the only person who did not matter. "You!" he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Clean this! Now!" Emmy, who had been quietly preparing to exit the room, flinched. She turned, her expression unreadable, and approached the table. She procured a clean cloth from her cart and knelt, her movements deliberate and careful. She was a shadow falling over the great mahogany table, a humble presence in a room built for gods of finance. As she gently blotted the stain, her eyes flickered over the Japanese characters printed beneath the English title on the proposal's cover. A tiny, almost imperceptible frown creased her brow. It was a fleeting expression, gone in an instant, but Julian saw it. The sight of this menial worker, this non-entity, having an opinion, any opinion, on his life's work, was an intolerable offense. His frustration, his terror, his rage, it all needed a target, and she was perfect, powerless, anonymous. The cruelty came to him easily, a native language he had spoken his entire life. A slow, contemptuous smile spread across his face. It did not touch his eyes. "You find something interesting?" he asked, his voice a low purr of menace. He leaned down, bringing his face uncomfortably close to hers. The scent of his expensive cologne, a sharp citrus and cedarwood fragrance, was overpowering. "Big words, big numbers. This is a bit above your pay grade, don't you think?" Emmy said nothing. She simply continued to blot the stain, her focus absolute, as if the small, dark circle were the most important thing in the world. Her silence was a defiance he could not tolerate. It was a refusal to participate in the drama of his own making, a quiet rejection of his power. He straightened up and turned to his junior executives, a ringmaster addressing his audience. "Maybe she can help us," he announced, his voice booming with false bonhomie. "She seems to have some thoughts. What do you think, fellas? Should we get her expert opinion?" The young men, desperate to please, snickered obediently. Their laughter was thin and sharp, the sound of ambition curdling into cowardice. They were sharks in training, learning to bite whatever their master pointed at. Julian turned his full, chilling attention back to Emmy. He crouched down again, this time adopting a tone of exaggerated, insulting simplicity, as if speaking to a dull child or a pet. "You, clean, good," he said, drawing out the words. He tapped the portfolio. "You, read English? A little bit?" Emmy finally looked up. Her eyes met his. For a moment, the mask of placid servitude slipped, and he saw something ancient and unbreakable in their depths. It was a flicker of a long-forgotten fire. She gave a single, curt nod. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, soft, and laced with the distinct accent of her homeland. Yes, a little. The accent was all the ammunition he needed. He pounced on it. A little, he roared, standing up and throwing his hands in the air for dramatic effect. The junior executives erupted in performative laughter. She speaks a little. Well, that settles it. He leaned over the table, a king leaning down from his throne. Tell us, O wise one from the housekeeping department. Tell us how to close a billion-dollar deal. Your insights will surely be invaluable. The humiliation was now complete. It hung in the air, thick and toxic. Emmy was no longer a person. She was a prop in his theater of cruelty, a tool to release his own anxiety. She was on her knees, the stained cloth in her hand, the target of their collective scorn. The laughter of the young men was the sound of dogs yapping at the heels of a lion, confident in the protection of their keeper. It was at that exact moment that the doors to the suite swept open. Mr. Ishikawa entered, flanked by his two senior advisors. He was a man who seemed to carry his own atmosphere of stillness with him. He was small and elderly, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his posture was ramrod straight. He wore a simple, dark suit of impeccable cut, and his eyes, behind thin-rimmed glasses, were as sharp and intelligent as a hawk's. He radiated a profound, unshakable authority that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. He and his delegation stopped just inside the door, taking in the scene. They saw the towering, sneering American CEO. They saw his cackling subordinates, and they saw the woman on her knees, the object of their ridicule. The laughter died instantly, choked off in the throats of the junior executives. The air crackled with a new, far more dangerous tension. Julian, caught off guard, spun around. The sneer on his face faltered, replaced by a hastily assembled mask of professional welcome. But the ugliness of the moment lingered, a foul odor that no amount of cologne could cover. Mr. Ishikawa's face remained impassive, a mask of courteous neutrality. But his eyes, cold and dark, saw everything. He registered the mockery, the power imbalance, the casual cruelty. He said nothing. His silence was a judgment more damning than any tirade. Julian felt a flush of hot shame, followed immediately by a surge of defensive anger. How dare they walk in on him? How dare this situation spin out of his control? He strode forward, his hand outstretched, his voice a booming performance of bonhomie that rang completely false. Ishikawa-san! Welcome! We were just sharing a light moment before our important discussion. Mr. Ishikawa did not take his offered hand. He gave a slight, formal bow, a gesture of politeness that was somehow also a rebuke. His gaze drifted from Julian, past the terrified junior executives, and settled once more on Emmy. Emmy remained on her knees, frozen for a heartbeat. The world had tilted on its axis. The private shame had become a public spectacle, witnessed by a man from the world she had lost. A world of honor, of respect, of quiet dignity. The laughter of Julian's men still echoed in her ears, a painful reminder of how far she had fallen. She had spent years building a wall of invisibility around herself, learning to be overlooked, to be silent, to endure. That wall had just been shattered. Something inside her broke. Or perhaps something was reforged. She rose to her feet. Not with the hurried, apologetic scramble of a servant, but with a slow, deliberate grace that drew every eye in the room. She was no longer just a maid in a faded uniform. The years of quiet suffering, of swallowed pride, of buried grief, coalesced into a single point of cold, crystalline resolve. She straightened her back, and in that simple movement, she seemed to grow taller. She looked at the stained proposal on the table. She saw the elegant Japanese script, the name Ishikawa, and next to it, the proposed name for the merged entity, and she saw the error. It was not a typo or a financial miscalculation. It was a mistake of the soul, an insult so profound, so deeply ignorant of Japanese culture, that it would have been unforgivable. Vance's team, in their Western arrogance, had proposed a name that, when translated, invoked a story of betrayal and dishonor from the Ishikawa family's ancestral history. It was the equivalent of naming a company after Judas Iscariot at a Vatican merger. Mr. Ishikawa's translator, a nervous young man, stepped forward to begin the formal introductions. He cleared his throat. Ishikawa-sama welcomes. He never finished the sentence. Emmy took one step forward and bowed. It was not the shallow, hurried bow of a hotel worker. It was a deep, perfect bow of respect, a gesture of profound formality from a world Julian Vance could not even begin to comprehend. Then she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was utterly transformed. The soft, accented English was gone. In its place was a voice of pure, liquid clarity, speaking the most formal, honorific form of Japanese, keigo. It was the language of emperors and diplomats, a level of speech so refined that even many native speakers struggled with its complexities. It was a voice that carried the weight of generations of culture and education. Ishikawa-sama, she began, her voice resonating with a quiet authority that silenced the entire room. Please accept my sincerest apologies for the deeply inhospitable welcome you have received. The discourtesy you have witnessed does not reflect the honor this hotel strives to uphold. Julian Vance stood as if turned to stone. His brain struggled to process what was happening. The sounds coming from the maid's mouth were familiar. He had heard Japanese spoken for 3 days. But this was different. This was music. This was power. He looked at his own translator, a highly paid expert from a top firm, and saw the man's jaw hanging open in stunned admiration. Mr. Ishikawa's eyebrows shot up. A flicker of astonishment, then intense curiosity, crossed his ancient face. He ignored Julian and his entire team, turning his full attention to Emmy. He replied in the same formal Japanese, his voice sharp with inquiry. You are a member of the hotel staff? I am, Emmy replied, still holding the bow. But I am also the daughter of a man who once held your family's name in the highest esteem. And for the sake of his memory, I cannot stand by and watch his old friend be subjected to such profound disrespect. She straightened, and her eyes, clear and direct, met Mr. Ishikawa's. Nor can I allow you to unknowingly consider a proposal that begins with a grave insult to your ancestors. She pointed a single, steady finger at the cover of the portfolio. That name, she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone, is an unforgivable error, one that a man of your stature should never have been asked to endure. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had undergone a tectonic upheaval. Julian Vance, the master of the universe, was now a spectator in his own suite. He was an outsider, deaf and dumb to the conversation that was deciding his fate. The junior executives looked at each other in panic, their faces pale. They had laughed at this woman. They had treated her like dirt. And now she was speaking to the man who held their careers in his hands, as if she were his equal. Mr. Ishikawa stared at Emmy, his gaze piercing. He walked slowly to the table and looked down at the proposal. He read the Japanese characters his advisors had, in their politeness, failed to warn him about so directly. His face, already a mask of stone, became a glacier. A cold, dangerous anger emanated from him. He looked back at Emmy. "Who is your father?" he asked, his voice quiet. "My father was Tanaka Kenji," she said simply. A wave of recognition and shock washed over Mr. Ishikawa's face. He took a half step back, as if struck. "Tanaka-san, of Tanaka Precision?" His voice was a whisper of disbelief. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the ghost of a man he had once known and deeply respected. I see him in you." The Imperial Suite was no longer a boardroom. It was a courtroom, and Julian Vance was in the dock, utterly clueless as to the nature of the crime he had just committed. He could only watch as the old Japanese titan and the hotel maid conversed in a rapid, fluid exchange, their shared language an impenetrable fortress around them. Finally, Mr. Ishikawa turned his gaze back to Julian. The polite mask was gone. His eyes were filled with a contempt so pure and cold, it was like a physical blow. He spoke in English, his words slow, deliberate, and utterly devastating. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "this meeting is over. The deal is cancelled." He paused, letting the words hang in the dead air. "We will not be doing business with a man who understands neither respect nor honor. And we will certainly not be doing business with the man whose family destroyed one of the finest men I ever knew." With that, he turned to Emmy and gave her a deep, respectful bow. "Tanaka-san," he said in Japanese, "would you do me the honor of joining my delegation? There is much we have to discuss." Emmy, her composure unwavering, returned the bow. "It would be my honor, Ishikawa-sama." And then they were gone. Mr. Ishikawa, his advisors, and Emmy Tanaka walked out of the suite, leaving Julian Vance standing in the wreckage of his ambitions. The heavy door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed back in was no longer the silence of purchased luxury. It was the silence of a tomb. Julian's world did not crumble slowly. It imploded. In the minutes that followed the delegation's departure, his phone began to vibrate with a furious, unrelenting intensity. The first call was from his chairman of the board, his voice a strangled cry of rage and disbelief. Mr. Ishikawa's office had already sent a formal, scathing notice severing all negotiations and citing irreparable cultural and ethical breaches. The news was already leaking to the financial press. "What did you do, Julian?" The chairman roared through the phone. "What in God's name did you do?" Julian had no answer. He stood numbly, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to the cacophony of his life's work being dismantled. He looked at his junior executives who were staring at him with a new expression. Not fear, not sycophancy, but a dawning, horrified contempt. They were seeing him, for the first time, not as a leader, but as a liability. A fool. The second call was from his head of PR. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal had received a tip, a very specific tip, about a CEO mocking a hotel maid in front of the Ishikawa delegation moments before a billion-dollar deal collapsed. The story was about to break, and it was going to be a bloodbath. His reputation, as carefully constructed and polished as his Patek Philippe, was about to be shattered into a million pieces. He sank onto the leather couch, the phone slipping from his nerveless fingers. The silence of the suite was now a roaring in his ears. He was surrounded by the trappings of his success, The art, the crystal, the panoramic view of a city that had once felt like his kingdom, and it all felt like a cheap movie set. Fake, weightless. He had built his entire identity on the idea of value, of worth, of knowing the price of everything. And he had just discovered, in the most brutal way imaginable, that he knew the value of nothing. Who was she? Tanaka Kenji? Tanaka Precision? The names meant nothing to him. Distant echoes from a corporate war fought and won by his father 2 decades ago. It was ancient history, a footnote in the ledger of Vance Global's triumphant rise. How could a ghost from the past rise up to destroy him in a hotel suite? The hotel manager arrived, flanked by security. The manager was a man whose entire career was built on a foundation of professional deference, but his face was now a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice tight. "Mr. Ishikawa has made a formal complaint. He has also requested that we extend his personal apologies to one of our staff, Miss Tanaka, for the environment she was subjected to in this room." The emphasis on the word environment was a stiletto knife. "We will have to ask you to vacate the suite," the manager continued. "Your company's corporate account with our hotel chain is under review." Being escorted out of his own suite like a common trespasser was the final, crushing humiliation. As he walked through the opulent lobby, he felt the stares of the staff. They knew. The whispers followed him like a cloud of poison. The invisible people, the ones he never saw, were now his judges and jury. Meanwhile, in a different suite on a higher floor, Emi Tanaka sat opposite Mr. Ishikawa. She had been offered tea, the finest gyokuro, served in delicate porcelain cups. The atmosphere was one of solemn respect. Mr. Ishikawa's advisors looked at her with awe. They had witnessed a masterclass in corporate diplomacy and a profound act of personal courage. "Your father," Mr. Ishikawa said, his voice gentle, "was a man of immense integrity. He built Tanaka Precision on a philosophy of quality and respect for his workers. He called it the soul of the machine. He believed that what he created was more than just a product. It was a legacy of craftsmanship." Emi nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I remember." "The way your father's company was taken," Ishikawa continued, his eyes hardening, "was a disgrace. It was a new kind of business, a Western way. Vulture capitalism. They didn't build, they only consumed. They found a small debt, a temporary downturn, and used it as a weapon to break him, to steal the soul of his life's work." He looked at Emi. "I did not know what became of you and your mother after he passed. We searched, but you had disappeared." "My mother was ashamed," Emi explained, her voice barely a whisper. "We lost everything. The house, our savings, our name. We moved to America. She wanted to forget. She worked until her hands were raw, cleaning houses so I could get an education. But she fell ill. I had to leave university to care for her. I took this job. It was all I could find." It was a story of quiet tragedy, of a life derailed by a single brutal act of corporate greed. The heiress to a legacy of precision engineering was scrubbing floors and changing bedsheets, her brilliant mind and deep cultural knowledge hidden beneath a servant's uniform. Mr. Ishikawa's senior aide, a man named Kaito, spoke up. "Ishikawa-sama, the man who led that takeover, the architect of the strategy that destroyed Tanaka Precision, was Julian Vance's father. But the key analyst, the one who found the financial vulnerability they exploited, was a brilliant, ruthless young man fresh out of business school." He slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was an old business article, The headline read, Vance Jr.'s first kill, the Tanaka takedown. Below it was a picture of a much younger Julian Vance, smiling, arrogant, triumphant. Emmy stared at the face of the man who had just humiliated her. The architect of her family's ruin, the man who had, in effect, killed her father. The connection was fated, a circle of pain and consequence that had finally closed after 20 years in a luxury hotel suite. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for cruel poetry. Julian spent the night in a lesser hotel under a false name, the kind of place he wouldn't have been caught dead in a day before. He didn't sleep. He drank, but the expensive whiskey brought no comfort. He just stared at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in his mind like a horror film. Her voice, speaking that elegant, powerful Japanese. Ishikawa's eyes, filled with cold fire. The sound of the door clicking shut on his entire world. The next morning, driven by a desperate, unfamiliar impulse, he returned to the five-star hotel. Not as a guest, but as a supplicant. He didn't go to the lobby. He went to the staff entrance around the back, a grimy door next to a row of dumpsters. He asked for Emmy Tanaka. He found her in the staff cafeteria, a brightly lit, sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and fried food. She was sitting alone at a small formica table, sipping a cup of tea from a thick ceramic mug. She was back in her uniform, the symbol of her invisibility. But she wasn't invisible anymore. Not to him. He approached her table, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place. He felt like an alien, a creature from another world. The other staff members stared at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and hostility. "Miss Tanaka," he began, his voice hoarse. "Emmy." She looked up at him, her gaze steady, unreadable. There was no anger in her eyes, no triumph, just a profound, soul-deep weariness. He fumbled in his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. It was his first, instinctual response to any problem. Throw money at it. "I want to apologize," he said, his words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "What I did was inexcusable. I want to compensate you. Name any amount. $1 million? $5 million? A new job? Head of a department at my company? Anything." He was offering her the very things the world had taught him to value: money and status. He was trying to transact his way out of a moral abyss. She looked at the checkbook in his hand, then back at his face. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her features. Pity. "You still don't understand, do you, Mr. Vance?" she said, her English quiet and precise. "You think this is about money." She stood up and began to tell him her story. Not the abbreviated version she had told Ishikawa, but the full, devastating account. She spoke of her father, a kind, brilliant man who treated his employees like family. She described the pride he took in his work, the way he would hold a newly milled gear up to the light as if it were a jewel. She spoke of the day the letters from Vance Global started arriving, cold and legalistic, filled with threats and demands. He didn't understand, she said. He thought business was about creating things, about building relationships. He didn't know how to fight men like your father. Men like you. She described the slow, agonizing death of the company, the layoffs of men who had worked there their whole lives, the shame her father felt. And she told him about the day he died, sitting in his favorite chair, holding an old company prospectus, his heart simply giving out under the weight of his failure. "Your father took his company," she said, her voice trembling with a grief that was still raw after 2 decades. "But you, Mr. Vance, you took his life. You were the one who found the knife for your father to use." The words struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, his face ashen. The old, triumphant headline, "Vance Jr.'s first kill," flashed in his mind. He had thought of it as a metaphor, a clever turn of phrase. He had never, not once, considered the flesh and blood reality behind the numbers on a spreadsheet. The man, Tanaka Kenji, had been an abstraction, a target, a problem to be solved. Now, he was a ghost with a face, a story, a daughter who was pouring him a cup of tea in a staff cafeteria. Julian Vance finally broke. The carefully constructed armor of arrogance and wealth, built up over a lifetime, shattered. A dry, ragged sob escaped his throat. He sank into the chair opposite her, a broken man. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "I was young. I wanted to impress him. My father, he only valued strength, winning. Anything else was weakness." And then, for the first time in his adult life, he told someone the truth. He spoke of his own gilded cage, of a childhood spent not with a father, but with a CEO who evaluated his son's performance on a quarterly basis. He spoke of the crushing pressure to be ruthless, to be successful, to be worthy of the Vance name. The takeover of Tanaka Precision wasn't just business. It was a test, a brutal rite of passage. "I won," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. I won his approval for the first time in my life, and I felt nothing, just empty. I've been trying to fill that emptiness with more deals, more money, more everything, ever since. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. It never works. In the sterile cafeteria, surrounded by the quiet clatter of cutlery and the hum of the vending machines, two people from opposite ends of the earth, a predator and his victim, finally saw each other. They were bound together by a single act of cruelty that had ruined one life and poisoned another. Emmy listened to his confession, her expression softening. She saw past the arrogant CEO and saw the broken boy who had been so desperate for his father's love that he had been willing to destroy another man's world to get it. The anger she had held on to for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a vast, aching sadness for them both. Julian looked up from his hands, his face a wreck of shame and regret. "What can I do?" he asked. It was not a transaction. It was not a negotiation. It was a genuine plea. "Please, tell me what I can do to fix this." Emmy was silent for a long time. She looked at this man who had held so much power, now utterly stripped of it, offering her the broken pieces of his life. Revenge would be easy. Ruining him further would be simple. But her father had not been a man of vengeance. He had been a builder. "You cannot fix what is broken, Mr. Vance," she said softly. "You can only build something new." That conversation was the beginning. Guided by Emmy's quiet wisdom and Mr. Ishikawa's stern, watchful eye, Julian Vance began the long, arduous process of dismantling his own life. He resigned as CEO of Vance Global, a move that sent shockwaves through the financial world. He sold his vast portfolio of stocks, his multiple homes, his collection of cars and art. He liquidated his empire. With the immense fortune he amassed, he did not start another company. He created a foundation. He insisted it be named the Tanaka Foundation, a public and permanent acknowledgement of the wrong he had done. Its mission was twofold: to provide financial and legal support to small, family-owned companies fighting off hostile takeovers, and to fund scholarships in ethical business practices at universities around the world. It was an institution designed to fight the very philosophy that had made him rich. The final act of his atonement was the most important. He approached Emmy not with an offer, but with a request. He asked her to run the foundation. He offered her the position of president and chairwoman of the board, with an ironclad charter that gave her absolute unilateral control. He would have no say, no vote, no power. His only role, if she would allow it, would be to work for her, in any capacity she saw fit. He was giving the power back. He was placing the legacy he had stolen from her father directly into her hands, trusting her to build something good from the ashes of his destructive life. 2 years passed. The Tanaka Foundation became a global force for good, a beacon of compassionate capitalism in a world often dominated by greed. Emmy Tanaka, no longer a maid, was now one of the most respected voices in international business. She moved through the world with a grace and confidence that had always been inside her, now finally allowed to shine. She stood at a podium at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the lights of the stage warming her face. She wore a simple, elegant dress, the spiritual successor to her old uniform, but now it was a symbol of her authority, not her servitude. She spoke about her father's philosophy, the soul of the machine, and expanded it into a new vision for a global economy based on dignity, respect, and shared humanity. "We have been taught to measure worth in stock prices and profit margins," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the vast auditorium. "We have been told that value is a number on a balance sheet. But true worth is not transactional. It is relational. It is measured in the lives we touch, the communities we build, and the dignity we afford to every single person, regardless of their station." In the third row of the audience sat Julian Vance. He was dressed not in a tailored suit, but in a simple blazer and slacks. He looked older, the sharp angles of his face softened by humility. He was no longer a CEO, no longer a titan of industry. He worked for the foundation as a logistics coordinator, arranging travel and scheduling meetings. It was quiet, anonymous work. It was the most fulfilling work he had ever done. As Emmy spoke, her eyes found his in the crowd. She smiled, a small, genuine smile of acknowledgement and shared understanding. He nodded back, his own eyes filled with a profound, quiet gratitude. The ghost of his father, the relentless pressure to win, the gnawing emptiness, it was all gone. He was finally at peace. Later, after the speeches and applause had faded, they met in a small, quiet cafe, far from the glitz and glamour of the summit. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in a peaceful white. They sat across from each other, two people from different worlds, their lives forever intertwined by a moment of cruelty and an act of grace. "You were wonderful," Julian said, his voice sincere. "My father would have been proud," Emmy replied, looking out at the snow. "Of both of us." There was no longer any debt between them. There was no anger, no guilt. There was only the quiet, unbreakable bond of a shared journey, from ruin to redemption. They had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the deepest wounds can sometimes create the most profound connections, and that a person's true value is never what they own, but what they are willing to give away. In the quiet cafe, over a simple cup of coffee, they had found a wealth far greater than any number on a balance sheet. They had found their humanity.